Yet my newfound Christian faith brought a new sense of fulfillment and appreciation to my studies and later my research in the sciences. I found that belief in God gave a new direction, a new animus, a new impetus to my investigation of nature. I gave up the sciences to read theology, but I still love them and try to keep up in the literature. And above all, I have a passion for trying to relate Christian theology to the natural sciences, and hence, I suppose, my presence here tonight. So I turn now to engage with Professor Dennett. An excellent book, lots to talk about, only time to talk about some things. The first point that Professor Dennett made that got me nodding my head in agreement comes very early in the book. People sometimes feel very defensive about religion. Religious people often get very defensive when challenged about the basis of their beliefs, and very often that does hinder any serious debate about the nature of faith. I think he's right there, and I know precisely what he means. I suspect the issue really is that a challenge to faith often threatens to pull the rug from under the values and beliefs that have sustained someone's life. But that, I think, is a general problem with any significant worldview, and not just a religion. I gave a lecture last year, I give many of these, on the religious views of Richard Dawkins. And it's very standard stuff. I argued that Dawkins' atheism was not adequately grounded in argument or evidence, and represented a very skewed reading of natural sciences. Afterwards, I was confronted by a very angry man who told me I had destroyed his faith. His atheism had rested on the authority of Richard Dawkins, and I had thrown his life into turmoil. Now, part of me, I suspect that the unregenerate part of me, felt that was just too bad, and that he ought to have been more critical about evaluating evidence. But another part of me noted that some beliefs, not all but some beliefs, matter so much to us that we base our lives upon them. We all need to examine our beliefs, Professor Dennett is right, especially if we are naive enough to think that we don't have any. So how, I wondered, would Professor Dennett clarify the distinction between a worldview and a religion? The distinction is notoriously imprecise, and many would say it's constructed by those who have some vested interest to defend. And here I must confess some puzzlement. Professor Dennett tells us that, I quote, "A religion without God or gods is like a vertebrate without a backbone." Now, if I were leading a sixth form discussion about how we might define religion, that would be the first definition to be considered, and I need to say, the first to be rejected, because it is so inadequate. What about non-theistic religions? Vertebrates, by definition, have backbones. The concept of religion does not entail God. So why that definition? I initially thought it was because Professor Dennett has American Protestant fundamentalism in his gun sights. It's a very American book, as Madeleine was hinting. But after I'd finished reading the book, I think I could see another explanation. If I've understood him correctly, Professor Dennett wants to explain religion in terms of evolutionary theory, and above all, the idea that belief in God confers some kind of survival advantages. So religions that don't believe in God don't really fit that bill. Very briefly, I have to say very simply that I was not persuaded by his account of what religion is. I think most religious people would find it actually quite difficult to relate to. Perhaps, I wonder, it might tell us more about what leading figures in America's political intellectual left think about religion, which I think is a rather more different and possibly more interesting matter. So let me now turn to what I think is the most interesting aspect of this book, its appeal to science. And it's an area that excites me, and Professor Dennett's earlier book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, shows that he has mastered some of the intellectual issues that he'd need to address in this book. And I would place Professor Dennett, broadly speaking, in the naturalist explanation of religion, which includes Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud. Whatever the benefits of religions might be, and there are some, Professor Dennett and these writers would argue that they arise entirely inside human minds. No spiritual realities exist outside us. Natural explanations may be given of the origins of belief in God. Now, I hesitate to mention this But this does rather seem to be a circular argument that presupposes its conclusions. So what models does Professor Dennett propose for the origins of faith in God? And I was delighted to find a rich range of explanatory approaches in this book. One is the sweet tooth theory. On this approach, just as we have evolved a receptor system for sweet things, so in a similar way, we might have a God center in our brains. Such a center might depend on a mystical gene that was favored by natural selection because people with it tend to survive better. Just a moment, I thought, where's the science? Where's the evidence for this? Instead, I found mights and maybes, speculation and supposition, instead of what I would hope for, which is evidence-driven and evidence-based argumentation. And at points I did feel that these theories are evidence-free and somewhat speculative. For example, we are told, as we were told a moment ago, that religious ideas could have spread from individual superstitions via shamanism and the early wild forms of strains of religion. Very interesting. But the evidence I'd like to see. I don't really see, for example, enough engagement with the history of religions, above all Christianity, which has plenty of history. Reminds me of some of those TV ads. This could help you lose weight as part of a calorie-controlled diet. Could. The TV ad writers would love to be able to say their product was clinically proven to do these things. But they don't, because the evidence really isn't there. Now, obviously, I wish I had time to do justice to Professor Dennett and to engage with each of the major models that I noted in working through this book, and sadly, I just don't have time. So what I want to do, if I may, is focus on the one I think is the strongest, and that indeed was the one Professor Dennett mentioned most in his presentation, which is the idea of the meme, a hypothetical cultural or intellectual replicator. And there's this model, as you heard, religions might be memes that infect our brains. They're not necessarily parasitic, but they could be symbiotic, conferring advantages on those who are infected. So let's think about this. Is belief in God a meme? It's an idea that Richard Dawkins floated back in 1976, and it lingers to this day. And I remember when I first came across this idea back in 1977, I was very excited by it, because I was beginning my career as an intellectual historian, and I felt that this might be a rigorous science-based approach to cultural, intellectual development that would actually aid my investigations. Others I know felt the same. But as I began to check this one out, it didn't really help me at all. It just didn't work. And after 10 years focusing especially on intellectual developments in the late Renaissance, I came to the conclusion it didn't work. But the real problems are far deeper. The meme is just an hypothesis. One I would want to argue that we simply don't need, because there are better models available, for example, in economics or in anthropology. If genes if we couldn't see genes, we'd have to invent them. The evidence demands a biologically transmitted genetic replicator. But memes cannot be observed, and the evidence can be explained perfectly well without them. As Maurice Bloch, who's Professor of Anthropology at LSE, commented recently, I quote, "The exasperated reaction of many anthropologists to the general idea of memes reflects the apparent ignorance of the proponents of the meme hypothesis of the discipline of anthropology and its major successes in the explanation of cultural development without feeling the need to develop anything like the meme at all." So at this stage in my argument, the issue is simply whether memes exist, irrespective of their implications for religion. I would argue that many scientists, in fact possibly most, are skeptical about them. As Simon Conway Morris, who's Professor of Evolutionary Paleobiology at Cambridge, pointed out, memes seem to have no place in serious scientific reflection. I quote, "Memes are trivial, to be banished by simple mental exercises. In any wider context, they are hopelessly, if not hilariously, simplistic." Now, in reading this book, I have to confess I was puzzled that the arguments of such leading critics of memetics were not identified and confronted point by point. And my concern is that this book, in my view, makes a critique of religion dependent on a hypothetical, unobserved entity which can be dispensed with completely to make sense of what we observe. Isn't that actually a core atheist critique of God? An unobserved hypothesis that we can dispense with easily in matters of explanation. If I were an atheist, I would want to drop this mimetic approach altogether, which I think simply weakens your case, and head back to the safer territory of Marxist dialectical reading of history, which in my view is much more intellectually rigorous and evidence-driven. But far be it for me, as a lapsed atheist, to tell those of you who still believe how to do your job.